Imagine the far north, long before maps were certain and before warmth could be summoned with the turn of a dial. Winter arrives not gently, but like a closing door. The sun retreats for weeks at a time, sometimes months, leaving behind a pale twilight that barely brushes the horizon. Snow hardens into ice. Wind moves across the land like an unseen force, shaping drifts, scouring skin, and reminding every living thing that survival here is never guaranteed. This was the world of the Vikings, and in this world, what you drank could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. To understand Viking drink, one must first understand Viking cold. The Nordic winter was not merely uncomfortable, it was relentless. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, and storms could trap families indoors for days. The sea, which provided food and travel in warmer months, became a barrier of black water and ice. Crops lay dormant beneath frozen soil. Hunting became harder, journeys more dangerous, and the simple act of staying warm required constant effort. In such conditions, every source of energy, comfort, and safety mattered deeply. Modern imagination often paints Vikings as roaring warriors, tankards raised high, drinking for pleasure or bravado. But that image dissolves quickly when placed against the reality of winter survival. For the people of the North, drinking was not about excess. It was about nourishment, preservation, and endurance. Liquids carried calories. They offered warmth, even if only the illusion of it. They provided safer alternatives to contaminated water. And just as importantly, they sustained morale during the darkest months of the year. In a world without glass windows, central heating, or reliable lighting, the longhouse became the center of winter life. Inside, a fire burned low and steady, its smoke finding its way out through a hole in the roof. Bodies gathered close, sharing warmth. Outside, the wind howled and snow pressed against wooden walls. Inside, people drank. Not quickly, not recklessly, but steadily, thoughtfully. Each sip was part of a larger rhythm that kept the household alive through the season. Water alone was not always safe. Streams could freeze or stagnate. Wells could become contaminated. Snow had to be melted, costing precious fuel. In winter, clean water was uncertain, and uncertainty was dangerous. Fermented drinks, on the other hand, were more reliable. The brewing process reduced harmful bacteria, making ale and other drinks safer than raw water. What might seem like a cultural preference was, in truth, a practical response to an unforgiving environment. But drink offered more than safety. It offered energy. Viking diets were heavy, built around meat, fat, and preserved foods, yet liquids played a key role in delivering calories in an easily consumable form. Thick alesh carried grains in liquid form, providing sustenance when chewing frozen bread or dried meat became difficult. Warm drinks soothed the body after exposure to cold, even if the warmth was temporary. In the stillness of winter nights, that comfort mattered. There was also the matter of the mind. Darkness weighs heavily on human spirit. Weeks without sunlight can drain strength in ways no storm ever could. Drinking together helped push back against isolation and fear. It marked time. It turned endless nights into shared moments. Stories were told, songs murmured, memories repeated. A cup passed from hand to hand was not just a drink, it was reassurance that one was not alone. For the Vikings, survival was never an individual act. It was communal. Drinking reflected this truth. Brewing required cooperation, knowledge, and planning long before winter arrived. Storage demanded discipline. Consumption followed rules, both spoken and unspoken. Children drank weaker versions. Elders drank carefully. Excess was not admired during winter, it was dangerous. A person who drank too much risked wasting resources, losing awareness, or becoming a burden on the group. This is why the question of what Vikings really drank matters. It is not a curiosity about ancient flavors or forgotten recipes. It is a window into how humans adapted to extreme conditions with intelligence and restraint. Every choice the Vikings made about drink was shaped by the land itself. The cold demanded respect, and drink was one way to show that respect. As snow buried paths and ice sealed rivers, life narrowed to what could be controlled within wooden walls. Barrels stored in cool corners. Skins hung to ferment. Herbs gathered months earlier now steeped in liquid. Each drink told a quiet story of preparation, patience, and survival. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was wasted. Even myth and belief reflected this reality. In Viking stories, drink often appears as a source of wisdom, poetry, and connection to the divine. These myths did not arise from indulgence, but from the recognition that drink held power. Power to sustain, to inspire, and to bind people together against a hostile world. In winter, that power was felt most strongly. So before we speak of ale or mead, of honey or herbs, we must first stand still in the cold north and feel the weight of winter pressing in from all sides. Only then can we understand why drink mattered so deeply. It was warmth when warmth was scarce. Safety when water could not be trusted. Energy when food ran low. And comfort when darkness seemed endless. This frozen world shaped every sip the Vikings took. And as we move deeper into their story, into their homes and halls, into their barrels and cups, we carry this truth with us. For the people of the North, drinking was never just about taste. It was about surviving the long night, together, one careful cup at a time. Before the sweet golden mead or the thick, warming ale became staples of the Viking winter, there was water, and water was never simple. In the harsh, frozen landscapes of Scandinavia, sources of life-giving liquid were scarce, unpredictable, and often dangerous. Streams trickled beneath snow, glacial melt shimmered in the brief sunlight, and wells dug deep into the earth promised purity but offered no guarantee. The Vikings, like all early peoples, understood that survival depended on knowing the limits of their environment. A single misstep, a contaminated spring, a poorly stored water supply, could bring fever, dysentery, or death. Winter transformed the landscape into both a sanctuary and a trap. Rivers slowed and thickened, often freezing over completely, hiding jagged ice beneath a seemingly smooth surface. Snow drifted over streams, masking holes and currents. Even if a source of water could be reached, it was rarely warm, rarely flowing, and rarely pure. Drinking directly from these streams without preparation could be a gamble. The dangers were invisible to the eye: bacteria, parasites, and the remnants of long-gone animals or travelers. These risks were not abstract. They were a daily calculation for anyone trying to endure the brutal cold. For the Vikings, knowledge of water sources was practical and communal. Families and clans knew which wells ran pure year-round and which springs were seasonal. Certain streams were avoided during heavy snowmelt, while others were trusted for their mineral-rich, filtering gravel beds. This knowledge was passed down quietly, through stories and repetition, not written guides. Water was a shared responsibility. Children were taught where to fetch it, elders taught how to test it, and anyone who made a mistake reminded the group of its fragility. Melting snow was one solution, though it carried its own challenges. Snow might appear pristine, but beneath the surface could lie dust, ash from fires, or traces of human or animal activity. Melted snow provided a sense of safety, but it required fuel, wood, peat, or even peat-fired ovens, to heat and purify. Fuel was precious in the winter months, and using it on water was a deliberate choice. The Vikings had to weigh the benefit of drinking against the cost of warming it, because in a long winter, every resource counted. Even water stored indoors was far from perfect. Wooden barrels, hollowed logs, or ceramic vessels held snowmelt or spring water, but contamination could occur if the container was not cleaned or if it was exposed to heat and dust. The concept of stale water was not merely unpleasant, it was dangerous. Early Vikings had an instinct for freshness. Water that smelled or tasted off was avoided, sometimes for days. This careful attention to detail was a matter of life and death, and it shaped the cultural habits that would eventually favor fermented beverages. The limitations of water created a natural incentive for innovation. If water could kill, could a different liquid sustain? And so, the process of fermentation gained prominence. Transforming grain into ale or honey into mead did more than create taste, it created safety. Fermentation reduced harmful microbes, preserved nutrients, and added calories in a form that could be consumed in cold conditions. Before drinking ale or mead became cultural tradition, It became practical necessity. In many ways, alcohol was the evolution of survival instincts, a method for making water safer, more nourishing, and more reliable. Yet the Vikings did not abandon water entirely. They remained mindful of its utility and risks, often blending simple water with other liquids to stretch resources. Dilution became an art. Weak ale or watered-down milk offered hydration while conserving stronger, more calorically dense beverages for times of scarcity or celebration. This careful balance between safety, nutrition, and indulgence illustrates the measured approach Vikings took toward liquids long before modern conveniences existed. Understanding water also sheds light on the broader rhythms of Viking life. Fetching, purifying, and storing water was labor-intensive, particularly in winter. It was a task shared across age and gender, quietly punctuating the daily routine. Snow had to be shoveled, ice broken, and wells dug and maintained. Families would wake before dawn to secure a day's supply, aware that a lapse could affect everyone in the household. The responsibility instilled a sense of awareness and discipline that permeated other aspects of Viking life, including how they approached brewing and drinking. The danger of water was mirrored by the seasons themselves. During summer, rivers swelled, carrying fresh water, fish, and nutrients, and while illness could still strike, abundance provided some buffer. Winter removed that buffer entirely. Every source of water became precious and every sip carefully considered. It is within this framework that fermented beverages rose not as indulgence, but as essential tools for survival. They were the safest way to maintain hydration and energy when pure water could not be trusted. Even the very act of drinking became ritualized. Fetching water, melting snow, and preparing barrels or vessels required timing and mindfulness. Cups were not wasted, portions were measured. The Vikings developed instincts for moderation not merely as cultural preference but as response to necessity. The environment demanded respect, and water, when scarce or uncertain, taught restraint. These early lessons informed the development of brewing, the careful storage of ale and mead, and the broader culture of communal consumption that would define Viking life in the north. In reflecting on this, one can appreciate the ingenuity required to thrive in such conditions. The Vikings were not passive in the face of scarcity. They observed, adapted, and transformed their environment. Water, the simplest of necessities, became both a challenge and an impetus for technological and cultural advancement. It forced communities to cooperate, innovate, and think ahead. And through this lens, the eventual dominance of ale and mead is no surprise. They were not luxuries, but carefully engineered solutions to a problem that water alone could not solve. Thus, the story of Viking drinking begins with water, ice, and the persistent challenge of purity. It is a story of adaptation, of careful observation, and of learning to respect forces beyond human control. Without this understanding, the significance of ale, mead, and other liquids is easily misunderstood. The drinks themselves were not the invention. They were the answer to an ancient question. How does one survive the bitter, frozen embrace of the north when water, the most basic sustenance, is unreliable? The answer is found in ingenuity, patience, and the slow transformation of raw necessity into something both nourishing and enduring, a precursor to the traditions that would define Viking winters for centuries. The Vikings' relationship with water teaches us about resilience and awareness. Every frozen stream, every carefully melted snowflake, and every barrel prepared for the coming season reflects a deep understanding of the environment and a quiet discipline that is easy to overlook. Before ale, before mead, before the familiar cups of Nordic lore, there was water, and it demanded respect. It shaped habits, dictated routines, and ultimately laid the foundation for the drinks that would carry Vikings through the long, merciless winters of the north. The story of Viking brewing begins not in celebration or ritual, but in necessity, in the quiet, smoky corners of the longhouse where survival and ingenuity intertwined. Before mead flowed in golden pools and ale warmed hands around a fire, there was grain, and there was fire, and there was time. These three elements were the foundation of every drink the Vikings would come to rely on during their harsh winters. Grain offered calories and substance, fire transformed it, and time worked its slow magic, turning a simple mixture into a liquid capable of sustaining life, body and spirit alike. In the longhouse, the process of brewing was a sacred, patient labor. The hearth, always alive with crackling flames, provided both warmth and the controlled heat necessary to begin the transformation. Barley, oats, or rye, sometimes a mixture, was soaked in water, allowing it to sprout, releasing sugars essential for fermentation. Sprouting took days, even weeks, and demanded attention. The grain had to be turned, kept moist but not wet, protected from frost or mold. This was not work done hastily. It was deliberate, precise, and rhythmic, performed with hands accustomed to both labor and observation. Once sprouted, the grain was dried over the fire, the smoke infusing it with a subtle aroma that would later define the flavor of ale. The Vikings understood intuitively that fire was more than heat. It was a tool of transformation. Too much smoke could ruin the batch, too little heat could leave it damp and prone to spoilage. The balance was delicate, the stakes high. Every decision, every movement of grain, reflected knowledge passed down through generations. Brewing was both art and science, and the Vikings approached it as carefully as any farmer tending crops or hunter stalking prey. When the grain was properly prepared, it was crushed and mixed with water. This mash, thick and heavy, began the next stage of alchemy. Left to rest, natural yeasts in the environment would slowly convert the sugars into alcohol, producing a drink that could sustain a body during the endless cold. Patience was key. The process could not be rushed without risking spoilage or weak flavor. In this respect, Viking brewing mirrored life itself. Survival required foresight, attentiveness, and an understanding that time, though slow, could yield reward. The brewing process also shaped the rhythms of the household. Long before winter settled in, preparations began. Families coordinated labor. Some tended to the fire, others to the grain, and still others to the vessels that would store the precious liquid. Wooden barrels, clay pots, and leather skins were scrubbed and dried, ready to contain the mash as it fermented. These vessels were carefully monitored. A crack in a barrel, a leak in a pot, or even a poorly sealed lid could spoil the effort of weeks. The work was continuous but gentle, a quiet attention to detail that shaped the culture of consumption and discipline that characterized Viking life. Brewing was also deeply social, though it was rarely performed for spectacle. Women often led the process in the household, their knowledge extensive and their hands steady. Men assisted when necessary, bringing fuel, water, or additional grain. Children were taught to observe, to learn the subtle signs of fermentation, the smell, the color, the slight bubbling that marked progress. Knowledge was embedded in daily life, a kind of quiet apprenticeship that ensured the skills survived through generations. Unlike modern production, the goal was not scale but sustenance, and the process reflected a deep respect for the ingredients and the seasons. Even the environment influenced brewing in subtle ways. Temperature variations in winter required constant adaptation. A cold snap could slow fermentation, while an unexpected thaw could encourage spoilage. Viking brewers developed intuitive responses, adjusting fire heat, moving vessels closer to or further from smoke, and sometimes blending batches to ensure consistency. Every sip of ale that would later warm a hand or calm a spirit had been touched by months of careful observation and adaptation. Brewing was not just about drink, it was about security. Barrels stored for winter represented stored energy, a liquid reserve that could support life when solid food was scarce. The process reflected a larger philosophy of survival: anticipate need, prepare thoroughly, and respect the passage of time. The Vikings' relationship with brewing teaches us that necessity can cultivate not just survival, but expertise, patience, and creativity. A well-brewed batch was a quiet triumph against the harsh elements, proof that knowledge and attention could temper the cruelty of winter. It is also important to understand that brewing in this period was not uniform. Recipes varied from household to household, often influenced by geography, available grains, or family tradition. Some alesh were thicker and more sustaining, intended to be consumed daily. Others were lighter, preserved for special occasions or feasts. Honey, herbs, and berries might be added to alter flavor or potency, though sparingly, as resources were precious. Even these minor variations carried significance, reflecting a subtle interplay of survival, taste, and cultural identity. By the time winter fully descended, longhouses held barrels and vessels of carefully prepared liquids, each one a testament to the patient, deliberate labor that preceded consumption. The rhythm of brewing had mirrored the rhythm of life. Observe, prepare, transform, and endure. In this, the Vikings created a kind of liquid insurance policy, one that carried sustenance, safety, and comfort through the darkest, coldest months. Every sip of ale or fermented grain drink was a connection to generations who had learned to respect the slow passage of time, the power of fire, and the resilience of grain. As we consider the birth of Viking brewing, it becomes clear that these drinks were never accidental, never frivolous. They were the result of careful observation, repeated experimentation, and a profound understanding of both natural processes and human needs. Brewing was survival turned into craft, a quiet mastery of elements that shaped Viking life for centuries. The fire, the grain, and the patience of time combined not just to create liquid, but to create continuity, comfort, and endurance in a world that demanded constant vigilance. In this sense, the longhouse becomes more than a shelter. It becomes a laboratory, a place of learning, and a quiet sanctuary against winter's relentless pressures. Brewing transforms the mundane into the meaningful, the survivalist into the artist, and the ordinary grain into a vessel of life. Each step, sprouting, drying, mashing, fermenting, is deliberate, measured, and purposeful. Every drop that eventually reaches the lips of the Vikings carries the weight of preparation, the wisdom of generations, and the warmth of fire amid the frozen landscape. Thus, the birth of Viking brewing is not merely the origin of ale and mead. It is a story of human ingenuity, patience, and adaptation, of people who turn necessity into art and labor into a source of survival. Fire, grain, and time were the tools, but understanding and care were the true ingredients. And as we move forward into the story of the drinks themselves, we see that every cup carries with it the quiet triumph of preparation, endurance, and a deep respect for the world the Vikings called home. In the north, the passage of time was measured less by calendars and clocks and more by the changing light, the migration of birds, and the slow march of snow across the landscape. For the Vikings, life was governed by the rhythm of the seasons, and no element of daily existence was more intertwined with this rhythm than drink. Brewing was not a spontaneous act, nor was drinking simply a matter of whim. Both were carefully planned to coincide with the cycles of planting, harvest, and winter, reflecting an intimate knowledge of nature, the land, and human endurance. Winter, in particular, demanded meticulous preparation, and the drinking habits of the Vikings reveal a culture shaped by anticipation, patience, and rhythm. As summer waned, the first considerations for winter brewing began. Grain from the fields was harvested and stored, each kernel carefully dried to ensure longevity. Honey was collected, pressed from wild hives or tended colonies, its golden sweetness a precious commodity. Vessels were prepared, barrels, clay pots, and wooden kegs were cleaned, repaired, and sealed. The process was laborious, requiring coordination across the household, yet it was essential. Winter's arrival was inevitable, and failure to prepare could mean hunger, thirst, or illness. In this sense, brewing was an act of foresight, a quiet, calculated defiance of the months of darkness and cold to come. Once the long nights settled in and frost thickened over the land, the rhythm of consumption began to emerge. Ale, with its low alcohol content and nutritional value, became the daily companion. Morning, midday, and evening, small portions were consumed to maintain energy and warmth. These were not indulgent sips, they were measured, deliberate, and consistent. A household without properly rationed ale could not survive the long winter. Even children received weaker brews, just enough to sustain them without risk. In this way, drinking followed a strict seasonal schedule dictated by need rather than desire. Mead, in contrast, was reserved for key moments within this rhythm. While ale marked the everyday passage of time, mead punctuated moments of significance. Festivals, religious ceremonies, victories, or significant social gatherings warranted its use. Its rarity and cost required careful allocation. Barrels of mead were counted and portioned, ensuring that the golden liquid would last through the season. This careful planning illustrates the Vikings' broader approach to life. Resources were not wasted, and the extraordinary was deliberately preserved for moments that demanded reverence. The process of winter brewing itself was shaped by the seasons. Fermentation required stable conditions, and in the absence of modern climate control, the Vikings relied on natural temperature fluctuations. Early winter, when the nights were long but not yet frigid, was ideal for initiating fermentation. The cold slowed activity just enough to prevent spoilage while allowing the transformation of grain into ale. The harshest months were a period of monitoring and patience, not active brewing. By the time spring approached, barrels were ready, and the house had accumulated a stockpile to sustain the household until the next cycle. Time, patience, and observation were as vital as the ingredients themselves. Winter also dictated drinking etiquette and allocation. Resource management was critical. Ale could be consumed regularly, but overindulgence risked depletion and weakness. Mead, reserved for special occasions, was portioned carefully, sometimes shared only with elders or leaders. Drinking became a silent lesson in moderation, an exercise in communal responsibility. The act of sharing a cup, passing a horn from one person to another, reinforced social bonds while honoring scarcity. Every sip had meaning. Waste was unthinkable. The Viking understanding of seasonal rhythms extended to the types of beverages consumed. Thick, nutritious ales were prioritized when the cold was most severe. Lighter, more flavored variants might be reserved for milder days or when company gathered. Herbal additives, berries, juniper, or birch bark, were sometimes incorporated to supplement nutrition or prevent illness, especially during long stretches when fresh food was limited. These variations were subtle but deliberate, reflecting an acute awareness of timing, need, and resource optimization. The longhouse itself became a hub of seasonal rhythm. Firelight flickered across walls, illuminating barrels and pots, each carefully labeled or stored. The scent of fermenting grain mingled with smoke and wood, marking the passage of days. Tasks were divided: tending the fire, checking fermenting barrels, fetching water or herbs. Brewing and consumption were not isolated acts but part of a larger temporal pattern, connecting the household to the environment and to each other. Time was slow, deliberate, and intertwined with nature itself. The psychological impact of these rhythms should not be underestimated. Long, dark nights could sap morale, yet the regularity of drink, meal, and communal activity provided comfort and stability. Ale offered warmth and nutrition, mead offered celebration and ritual. Both reinforced a sense of continuity and control in a world otherwise dominated by uncertainty. Drinking became a marker of temporal and social order, a predictable and reassuring element in the harshness of winter. Even within storytelling and mythology, these seasonal rhythms were reflected. Tales often describe feasts following harvests, blots timed to celestial events, and celebrations aligned with the lunar or solar calendar. Such narratives reinforced the importance of timing, of preparation, and of mindful consumption. The Vikings understood that survival and cultural continuity depended not only on what they drank, but when and how they drank it. By aligning their brewing cycles and drinking practices with the rhythm of the seasons, Vikings created a system that was both practical and profoundly human. It allowed households to endure the coldest months, sustain energy, and maintain morale. It provided structure, purpose, and social cohesion. The ale and mead were not merely beverages. They were instruments of survival, markers of time, and symbols of continuity. Ultimately, the Viking approach to seasonal drinking reflects an understanding that resonates even today. It demonstrates a culture attuned to the environment, disciplined in preparation, and wise in allocation. Winter was a test, but it was a predictable one, and the careful management of brewing cycles ensured that households faced the dark months not in despair, but with a quiet confidence. Ale for sustenance, mead for ritual, both integrated into a rhythm that harmonized with nature and human necessity. This synchronization of drink, time, and life was a hallmark of the Vikings' enduring resilience, a testament to their ability to convert necessity into culture and cold into comfort. In the bitter expanse of the northern winter, warmth was the most coveted form of sustenance, as crucial as food or water. The Vikings understood this instinctively, and drink became an essential tool in the battle against cold. Yet the warmth that alcohol provided was a curious and deceptive thing. While a cup of ale or mead could make the hands tingle, the cheeks flush, and the body feel temporarily comforted, it did not truly generate heat. The sensation was physiological, a redistribution of blood to the skin's surface, rather than a deep, internal warming of the body. Despite this limitation, the Vikings employed drink strategically, using it to maintain morale, stimulate circulation, and provide calories in liquid form, all of which contributed to survival in the frozen north. Ale, the staple of everyday life, was particularly valuable in this regard. Its dense, grain-rich composition provided not just hydration but energy. Each cup contained carbohydrates, proteins, and trace nutrients, offering a concentrated source of calories that could be consumed quickly and efficiently. In the dead of winter, when food sources were scarce and solid meals were difficult to prepare or digest, ale became a critical supplement. A sip here, a cup there, provided slow-burning energy that could keep bodies functioning during long hours of labor, travel, or domestic chores. The Vikings also understood the role of fat and sugar in combating cold. Mead, with its high sugar content, offered rapid energy, while ale's residual grains and fats provided more sustained caloric intake. The combination of these beverages with preserved meats, fish, and dairy created a multi-layered strategy for enduring the extreme cold. The warmth of the hearth, the thick garments woven from wool and fur, and the nutrition supplied by both solid and liquid foods formed an integrated system of survival, in which drink played an indispensable part. Despite the benefits, the Vikings were aware of alcohol's limitations. Drinking excessively could create the illusion of warmth while actually lowering core body temperature. Alcohol causes vasodilation, drawing blood toward the skin's surface and away from internal organs. In an environment where frostbite and hypothermia were real threats, moderation was essential. Ale, with its low alcohol content, was safer for frequent consumption. Stronger mead or fortified brews were reserved for special occasions or ceremonial moments, not everyday use. The Vikings' instinctive understanding of this principle demonstrates a sophisticated approach to survival, balancing the immediate comfort of perceived warmth against the physiological risks of overindulgence. Drinking for warmth also carried psychological significance. Winter in the north was oppressive, not only because of the cold but because of the unrelenting darkness and isolation. Ale and mead provided more than calories. They offered reassurance, a moment of relief, a sense of human presence and domestic order. A cup passed from one hand to another in a longhouse was a gesture of care, a signal that someone had attended to the household's needs, that the night was being endured collectively. This emotional sustenance was as vital as the drink itself, helping to maintain morale during the most challenging months of the year. The Vikings also incorporated drink into their daily routines to optimize its benefits. A morning cup of warm ale might precede laborious tasks, providing both energy and a brief sense of comfort. Midday consumption could prevent fatigue, while evening cups helped calm the body and mind before rest. The timing was deliberate, informed by experience and observation rather than arbitrary habit. Each cup served a purpose, integrated into a rhythm that aligned with work, rest, and the environmental challenges of winter. Furthermore, drink was often combined with other warming strategies. Ale and mead were consumed alongside hot meals, soups, and stews, amplifying their effect. Hot water mixed with herbs, sometimes fermented slightly, offered additional comfort and mild stimulation. Clothing, bedding, and fire were all part of the same system, and drink acted as a lubricant, facilitating the body's ability to maintain function in extreme cold. The Vikings treated drink not as a luxury but as a tool, a carefully calibrated element in their seasonal survival strategy. Nutrition and caloric intake were central considerations. Winter forced reliance on preserved foods, salted meats, dried fish, and fermented dairy that could be difficult to digest or provide uneven energy. Ale's grain content provided soluble carbohydrates that were easier to metabolize, while mead's sugar offered quick energy during periods of activity. In combination, these beverages helped balance the body's caloric budget, sustaining labor, travel, and domestic work. In effect, drink functioned as a portable, versatile supplement, tailored to the challenges of cold, scarcity, and prolonged darkness. The Vikings also exhibited an intuitive understanding of moderation in relation to both caloric intake and alcohol content. A household that consumed all its ale too quickly risked energy deficits later in the season. Too much mead could impair judgment or physical function. This balance extended beyond individual survival to communal well-being. Shared resources were carefully rationed, and drinking habits were influenced by social norms and the collective need for endurance. Ale, accessible and sustaining, became the foundation of daily life, while mead's limited supply highlighted moments of significance, reinforcing both physical and cultural rhythm. Drinking for warmth was, in essence, an intersection of physiology, psychology, and social coordination. The Vikings optimized what they could control: timing, content, and portion, while respecting what they could not: the relentless cold and the long, dark nights. Each cup was a calculated act of endurance, providing energy, temporary warmth, and reassurance in equal measure. Ale and mead were therefore not indulgences but instruments of survival, carefully tailored to the harsh realities of life in the north. Ultimately, the Vikings' approach to drink demonstrates a profound understanding of human needs under extreme conditions. They recognized that warmth, sustenance, and morale were inseparable and that liquid nourishment could address all three simultaneously, if used wisely. Ale and mead were central to this strategy, one for daily caloric support and moderate comfort, the other for ceremonial energy and symbolic significance. Through careful observation, practical experimentation, and cultural wisdom, the Vikings mastered the art of using drink not just to survive but to thrive in a world of frost, darkness, and relentless challenge. In this way, every cup of ale or mead carried more than physical content. It was the product of planning, experience, and respect for natural limits. It was a tool for endurance, a measure of communal care, and a subtle agent of warmth and psychological stability. Drink, in the Viking world, was a cornerstone of winter survival, a delicate blend of nourishment, comfort, and awareness, illustrating that the most enduring lessons of the North were learned not only in labor and travel but also in the quiet, deliberate act of sipping against the cold. In the frozen North, when darkness stretched across the land for weeks at a time and the wind howled against the wooden walls of longhouses, survival was as much a matter of social cohesion as of food or drink. The Vikings understood that human endurance was fragile in isolation, and that the long nights could erode morale as dangerously as the frost could sap strength. In this context, drinking became more than sustenance. It became a vital instrument of social survival. Ale and mead were shared in communal spaces, and these long, quiet nights in feasting halls were transformed by ritual, conversation, and the subtle warmth of shared cups. The longhouse itself was a center of both domestic and social life. Its walls, often made of timber and turf, enclosed families, animals, and resources, creating a microcosm of the larger world. Fires burned low and steady in central hearths, smoke curling through holes in the roof, carrying both warmth and the scent of cooking. In these spaces, cups of ale were passed from hand to hand, and the act of drinking together became a daily exercise in cohesion. Every shared sip reinforced trust, established routine, and reminded each member of the household that they were part of a collective effort against the harshness outside. Ale, the everyday drink, dominated these gatherings. Its moderate alcohol content allowed people to drink steadily without compromising alertness or health, which was essential in winter when energy and awareness could be matters of life and death. Children were given watered-down versions, elders sipped carefully, and adults consumed just enough to feel a gentle warmth without becoming careless. The communal passing of cups created rhythm and ritual, a quiet choreography of care that maintained both morale and social order. Drinking was a reminder that survival was not an individual endeavor, it was a shared responsibility. Evening hours in the longhouse were long and demanding. With sunlight barely touching the horizon, people relied on routines to structure their days. The firelight flickered across walls lined with stored food, barrels of ale, and carefully stacked wood. Conversation and storytelling occupied the hours, with drink acting as a lubricant for social interaction. The psychological effect of communal drinking cannot be understated. A shared cup reassured the weary, connected generations, and gave continuity to lives that might otherwise be overwhelmed by monotony, cold, and darkness. Special occasions transformed these routines into celebrations, yet even then, drinking remained disciplined. Festivals, seasonal feasts, and ceremonial blots brought mead into prominence, but the basic social structure persisted. Elders, chieftains, and honored guests received portions first, and the rhythm of pouring, sipping, and passing cups was observed carefully. Even merriment was tempered by respect for scarcity and practical awareness. Resources were precious, and the long winter required thoughtful management. In this way, drinking was both joyous and purposeful, a balance of indulgence and restraint. Storytelling was inseparable from drinking. Tales of gods, ancestors, and legendary exploits were recounted in the flickering firelight, each narrative reinforced by the communal presence of liquid. Ale grounded the story in the ordinary and familiar, while mead elevated it to the extraordinary. This interplay reflected the dual function of drink in Viking society. It was both sustenance and culture, necessity and ritual. As listeners absorbed tales, the cup in their hands served as a tactile anchor, a reminder of their connection to lineage, community, and shared experience. Physical comfort also played a role. Thick ale provided calories, helping to sustain energy through long nights when activity was limited and the cold persisted relentlessly. Firelight and drink combined to create warmth that extended beyond the body to the mind, generating a sense of psychological resilience. The presence of others, the rhythm of shared cups, and the soft murmur of conversation created an environment where human connection became a shield against despair. Drinking was, in this sense, a mechanism for mental as well as physical survival. The social importance of drinking extended to rites of inclusion and respect. Initiation of new members, guests from distant settlements, or young adults coming of age often involved the careful sharing of cups. To pass a horn or mug was to signify trust, welcome, and recognition. The act communicated unspoken rules of hierarchy, community, and mutual reliance. Drinking was both a practical resource and a symbol of belonging, reinforcing the bonds that were essential when the outside world was dangerous and unpredictable. Feasts and long nights also structured time. Drinking followed implicit schedules. Morning or midday cups provided energy for labor or chores, evening cups signaled communal reflection and relaxation, and late-night sips accompanied storytelling or quiet contemplation. Even in periods of celebration, the cadence of consumption reflected the rhythm of survival. The Vikings understood that excess could jeopardize both individuals and the household, and moderation was subtly enforced through custom and expectation. Herbs and other additives occasionally flavored drinks, sometimes providing mild medicinal benefits or preserving freshness over long winters. Juniper berries, birch bark, or fermented fruits were introduced sparingly, enhancing taste or promoting health while reinforcing the seasonal and local connection of drinking to the land. Every ingredient, every cup, carried meaning beyond simple hydration. It reflected ingenuity, attentiveness, and the integration of culture with survival. In essence, the longhouse and its feasting halls were laboratories of social cohesion, with ale and mead serving as both tools and symbols. Shared drinking fostered connection, reinforced communal norms, and provided the psychological reinforcement necessary to endure months of darkness and cold. It exemplified how the Vikings integrated human needs, nutrition, warmth, social interaction, into a cohesive system of survival. Through this lens, drinking was not leisure, it was a central pillar of life, a practice that cultivated both body and community. Ultimately, the long nights of the North were endured not simply through fire or food, but through the quiet, deliberate acts of social drinking. Ale nurtured the ordinary, sustaining bodies and spirits day by day, while mead elevated moments of significance, linking the living to ancestors, gods, and communal memory. Both drinks, shared in the intimate and protective spaces of longhouses, were instruments of endurance. They transformed isolation into connection, cold into comfort, and monotony into ritual, proving that the Vikings' true survival depended as much on social intelligence and shared experience as on the physical resources of the land. Beyond the golden glimmer of mead and the thick, sustaining presence of ale, Viking survival relied on another set of liquid resources: milk, whey, and fermented dairy. These humble drinks, often overlooked in the grand narratives of Viking culture, were quietly vital. They provided essential nutrients, complemented the caloric contribution of grain-based beverages, and offered a form of sustenance that was both practical and versatile in the long, unforgiving winters of the north. Understanding their role reveals the depth of Viking ingenuity, as well as the careful balance they maintained between necessity, preservation, and nutrition. Milk came primarily from cows, goats, and occasionally sheep, providing a steady source of protein, fats, and minerals. In a landscape where fresh meat was seasonal and hunting unpredictable, dairy offered a reliable, renewable resource. Fresh milk was consumed quickly, often within hours of milking, as it could spoil rapidly without modern refrigeration. This urgency required both planning and discipline, ensuring that households allocated milk wisely for drinking, cooking, or further processing. Milk was not merely a drink. It was an investment in immediate nutrition and a building block for other products that would sustain the household for months. One of the most valuable innovations was the production of whey, the liquid byproduct left after curdling milk to make cheese. Far from being waste, whey was rich in protein, vitamins, and minerals, and could be consumed as a drink or used in cooking. Its slightly tangy taste reflected its fermentation, and this natural process extended its shelf life, making it particularly useful in winter when fresh milk was limited. Whey exemplifies the Vikings' resourcefulness. Every part of their liquid food supply was utilized efficiently, reducing waste and maximizing sustenance. Fermented dairy took this ingenuity further. Sour milk, kefir-like beverages, or lightly curdled milk were produced deliberately, leveraging natural bacterial cultures to preserve the liquid and enhance its nutritional profile. These drinks were easy to store, resistant to spoilage, and could be consumed throughout the winter. The fermentation process also improved digestibility, breaking down lactose and making nutrients more bioavailable. In essence, Viking fermented dairy was a functional drink, a blend of science and tradition that transformed perishable resources into enduring sustenance. The integration of milk, whey, and fermented dairy into the Viking diet was strategic. These drinks provided hydration and nutrition simultaneously, supplementing the calories from ale and the sugar from mead. They were particularly important for children, whose caloric needs were high and whose consumption of alcohol was restricted. A warm cup of whey or fermented milk could sustain energy levels, support growth, and offer comfort on frigid nights. For adults, dairy was a practical complement to the heavier grain-based drinks, balancing protein, fat, and carbohydrate intake. Milk and its derivatives were also deeply embedded in household economy and labor cycles. Herding animals required daily attention, and milk collection was a rhythm that punctuated the day. In winter, when outdoor tasks were limited, caring for livestock and processing dairy provided structure and productivity. Fermentation and storage were also communal, often involving shared knowledge of techniques and environmental cues. The Vikings understood that timing, temperature, and container selection were critical for successful preservation, and these practices reflected a sophisticated awareness of both biology and environment. The versatility of dairy extended into culinary and medicinal applications. Milk and whey could be heated, combined with grains or herbs, or fermented to create new flavors and textures. These liquids sometimes served as bases for porridge, soups, or broths, offering both hydration and sustained energy. They also provided mild medicinal benefits. Fermented dairy could support digestion, provide probiotics, and prevent deficiency in nutrients like calcium and vitamin B12. In this sense, dairy was multifunctional, bridging the gap between drink, food, and health. Even in the social sphere, dairy played a subtle role. In the longhouse, cups of whey or fermented milk were shared alongside ale, supporting collective endurance during long nights. While these beverages lacked the ceremonial significance of mead, they reinforced communal bonds through their presence in daily routines. The act of sharing dairy, like the act of brewing ale, was a quiet demonstration of trust, resource management, and care for one another, a reminder that survival depended as much on cooperation as on physical resources. The seasonal aspect of dairy consumption also reflects Viking ingenuity. Summer and early autumn were periods of abundance, when milk was fresh and plentiful. Winter demanded preservation, careful rationing, and fermentation. These seasonal rhythms dictated storage strategies, brewing cycles, and household labor. Fermented dairy became a linchpin of survival, extending the utility of perishable milk into months of scarcity. This continuity illustrates the Vikings' sophisticated approach to aligning food, drink, and environmental cycles. Dairy also intersected with other drinking practices. Ale, mead, and dairy were not consumed in isolation. They formed an integrated system of sustenance. Ale provided calories and mild warmth, mead offered ritual and symbolic significance, and dairy offered protein, hydration, and functional nutrition. Together, these liquids created a balanced, layered approach to survival, each element reinforcing the others and contributing to both individual health and household resilience. In essence, milk, whey, and fermented dairy were unsung heroes of the Viking diet. They were practical, resource-efficient, and nutritionally dense, forming a foundation that complemented the more celebrated drinks of ale and mead. Their preparation required knowledge, observation, and patience, and their consumption reinforced both physical endurance and social cohesion. Far from being ancillary, these dairy beverages were central to survival, particularly during the long, dark, and cold winters of the north. Through these humble liquids, the Vikings demonstrated a profound understanding of their environment and their own physiology. They recognized that sustenance was more than calories. It was energy, hydration, and resilience in a package that could endure time and temperature. By fermenting, curdling, and preserving milk, they extended its utility, transforming a perishable resource into a reliable source of nourishment, comfort, and community. Every cup carried intention, knowledge, and adaptability, reflecting the ingenuity that allowed Viking households to thrive where survival was never guaranteed. Thus, the story of Viking drink extends beyond the grandeur of ale and mead. Milk, whey, and fermented dairy represent the subtle, strategic practices that underpinned daily life. They remind us that survival was not achieved solely through heroism or festivity, but through careful observation, resource management, and the quiet, consistent labor of preparation. In their integration of these liquids, the Vikings created a resilient, adaptable system of sustenance, one that ensured endurance, health, and continuity through the harshest seasons of the north. Beyond the practical sustenance of ale, mead, and dairy, the Vikings possessed a subtler, almost alchemical understanding of their drinks. They recognized that flavor was not merely a luxury, but a tool to enhance both nourishment and well-being. Herbs, berries, bark, and other natural flavoring agents were incorporated into beverages with deliberate care, creating liquids that satisfied the palate, extended shelf life, and occasionally offered medicinal benefits. These additions transformed ordinary sustenance into an experience that nourished body, mind, and spirit, reflecting the Vikings' holistic approach to survival and daily life. The first and most common flavoring agents were local herbs and plants, harvested from the surrounding landscape. Juniper berries, birch bark, and various aromatic herbs were valued not only for their taste but for their preservative qualities. Juniper, with its sharp, pine-like flavor, added a subtle bitterness that balanced the sweetness of mead or the earthy heaviness of ale. Birch bark introduced tannins that acted as natural preservatives, slowing microbial growth and extending the drink's usability through long winters. Herbs such as thyme, mint, and savory were used sparingly, often for medicinal purposes, to support digestion or ward off mild illnesses. Every choice carried intention, blending practical function with sensory enhancement. Berries were another important ingredient. Lingonberries, bilberries, cloudberries, and rowanberries were collected during summer and early autumn, then stored or dried for winter use. These berries could be mashed into ale or mead, providing subtle sweetness, tartness, or aromatic complexity. Beyond flavor, they contributed vitamins and antioxidants, offering protection against scurvy and other deficiencies during months when fresh produce was scarce. In this sense, flavoring agents were not merely decorative, they were embedded into the Vikings' survival strategy, combining nutrition, preservation, and pleasure in a single practice. Roots and barks were equally significant. Certain tree barks, like oak or alder, were boiled into decoctions and added to drinks to improve shelf life or introduce subtle bitterness. Roots such as angelica, licorice, or sweet cicely were sometimes incorporated to balance sweetness, ease digestion, or provide aromatic depth. The careful layering of these ingredients demonstrates a nuanced understanding of chemistry and biology, achieved without formal scientific knowledge. The Vikings learned through observation, experimentation, and the accumulated wisdom of generations which combinations were safe, flavorful, and effective. Honey, already central to mead, could be augmented with herbs or spices to create layered flavors. A batch of mead might include wild thyme, juniper berries, or even dried flowers, each addition enhancing aroma and taste. These subtle modifications reflected both practicality and creativity. A flavorful drink encouraged consumption, helping to maintain hydration and caloric intake, while also providing small psychological rewards in the monotonous landscape of winter. In this way, flavoring agents served multiple purposes. They preserved, they nourished, and they delighted. Some ingredients were chosen specifically for medicinal effect. Herbs with mild antiseptic, diuretic, or digestive properties were common. For example, meadowsweet could be added to reduce acidity, while yarrow might support blood flow or reduce inflammation. The Vikings integrated these botanical remedies directly into their beverages, blurring the line between nourishment and medicine. A cup of ale or mead was therefore not only sustenance but preventative care, reflecting an intimate understanding of health and the body's needs during harsh conditions. The timing and method of addition were also deliberate. Herbs, berries, or roots were often added at precise stages of fermentation to maximize their impact without disrupting the brewing process. Early additions might alter fermentation kinetics, while later additions preserved aroma and flavor. This careful sequencing reflects the Vikings' mastery of trial, error, and observation. Over generations, households accumulated highly specific knowledge about which combinations were safe, which enhanced taste, and which preserved the drink for months of consumption. Flavoring also had social and cultural significance. Certain blends were associated with feasts, rituals, or particular households. A specific mead with rowan berries or a uniquely spiced ale could signal status, skill, or tradition. These drinks became part of cultural memory, passed down through family recipes and local custom. In this sense, flavoring was both practical and symbolic, connecting the physical experience of drinking to heritage, identity, and social cohesion. Even in everyday use, flavored beverages offered psychological comfort. The monotony of winter, long nights, short days, relentless cold, was tempered by subtle shifts in taste and aroma. Juniper-infused ale or berry-sweetened mead provided small, consistent pleasures that reinforced morale. These flavors created a connection to the land, reminding the Vikings of summer abundance and the cyclical nature of seasons. They were quiet affirmations that, despite the harshness outside, human ingenuity and beauty persisted inside the longhouse. The use of herbs, spices, and other additives also reflects broader Viking adaptability. Resources were scarce, environments harsh, and spoilage a constant threat. Yet through careful selection and creative application, the Vikings expanded the utility of every beverage. Flavoring extended shelf life, improved nutrition, enhanced psychological well-being, and strengthened social bonds. In this sense, a well-crafted cup was not merely a drink, it was a culmination of environmental knowledge, culinary skill, medicinal insight, and cultural practice. Finally, these practices illustrate a sophisticated sensory awareness. Vikings understood that taste, aroma, and texture could influence behavior, encourage consumption, and improve endurance. Flavoring agents were therefore integrated with intent, transforming ordinary sustenance into holistic nourishment. A cup of ale or mead, thoughtfully augmented with herbs or berries, became a multidimensional experience, addressing hunger, energy, hydration, comfort, and even mental resilience. It was a quiet reflection of the Vikings' ability to observe, adapt, and enhance the ordinary, turning necessity into subtle art. In conclusion, the use of herbs, spices, and flavoring agents in Viking drinks demonstrates that survival was never purely functional. Every addition had multiple purposes: to preserve, to nourish, to protect, to uplift. Flavored beverages bridged utility and pleasure, creating drinks that were at once practical and symbolic, sustaining and enriching. In the darkness of winter, these aromatic, subtly layered liquids became more than sustenance. They were a testament to the ingenuity, resourcefulness, and refined sensibilities of a people who had learned to thrive where the cold was absolute and the land unforgiving. The image of Vikings often conjures scenes of fierce warriors raising horned cups in raucous feasts, their lives fueled by alcohol and conquest. Yet the reality of Viking drinking was far more nuanced, grounded in practicality, nutrition, and health-conscious traditions. Alcohol, whether in the form of ale or mead, was carefully managed, integrated into diets, and balanced with other sources of nutrition such as dairy, grains, and preserved foods. Drinking was as much about survival, endurance, and vitality as it was about ritual or pleasure, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of human physiology long before modern science could explain it. Ale, with its low alcohol content and grain-rich composition, served as a daily nutritional supplement. Its calories, carbohydrates, and protein provided energy for manual labor, travel, and household chores, particularly during the harsh winters. Unlike modern alcoholic beverages designed primarily for intoxication, Viking ale was functional. Its mild alcohol content allowed for regular consumption without compromising judgment or physical performance. In essence, it acted as a liquid bread, a portable form of sustenance that could be easily consumed throughout the day. Regular intake of such a drink likely contributed to the Vikings' ability to endure physically demanding tasks over long periods, supporting both stamina and resilience. Mead, by contrast, was stronger and reserved for special occasions, religious ceremonies, and social gatherings. Its sugar content provided quick energy, while its alcohol content introduced mild relaxation or euphoria. Consumed judiciously, mead enhanced social cohesion, reinforced ritual, and even contributed psychologically to endurance. However, excessive consumption could compromise both health and safety. The Vikings' awareness of these risks meant that drinking practices were carefully moderated. Ale was consistent and nourishing, mead was rare and symbolic, and both were integrated into a broader dietary and social framework. Dairy-based drinks, such as milk, whey, and fermented milk, complemented alcohol consumption by supplying protein, fat, calcium, and vitamins. These beverages ensured that caloric intake was balanced and that essential nutrients were maintained during long winters when fresh food was scarce. The combination of grains, alcohol, and dairy created a surprisingly robust nutritional system, supporting health, energy, and recovery. This dietary synergy helped explain how Vikings maintained physical vigor despite challenging climates, long periods of fasting, and demanding work routines. Herbs, berries, and imported spices also contributed indirectly to health. Many of these additions possessed medicinal properties, aiding digestion, boosting immunity, or acting as mild antiseptics. Juniper, birch bark, angelica, and meadowsweet were common examples, carefully integrated into beverages to preserve, flavor, and promote well-being. Even when their effects were subtle, they demonstrated an awareness of the connection between nutrition, environment, and health, turning everyday drinking into a form of preventive care. Contrary to romanticized myths of unrestrained drunkenness, Viking drinking was deliberate, disciplined, and strategic. Excessive consumption was neither culturally endorsed nor practical. Alcohol impaired judgment and could lead to accidents or depletion of critical resources. By structuring drinking around the types of beverage, time of day, and social context, the Vikings maintained a balance that protected both the individual and the household. This moderation likely contributed to overall longevity and resilience, countering the misconception that Viking life was inherently reckless or self-destructive. Archaeological evidence supports this view. Skeletal remains indicate that Vikings maintained reasonably good nutrition and bone health, particularly when accounting for the environmental challenges they faced. Dental and skeletal analyses reveal limited signs of malnutrition or alcohol-related damage compared to other contemporary populations, suggesting that drinking was integrated into a balanced and nutrient-rich diet. While they faced dangers from warfare, accidents, and disease, their structured approach to food and drink mitigated some of the physiological stresses of northern life. Myths surrounding Viking drinking often exaggerate excess while overlooking its functional aspects. Tales of continuous feasting and drunken brawls ignore the central role of ale as a daily calorie source, mead as ceremonial reinforcement, and dairy as essential nutrition. Modern imagination emphasizes dramatics, but historical reality emphasizes practicality. Drinking was a measured act, embedded in household labor, social ritual, and environmental adaptation. The Vikings' enduring legacy lies not in drunken abandon but in the deliberate, thoughtful integration of beverages into life-sustaining systems. The long-term effects of this drinking culture were likely positive in ways that align with modern understandings of moderate alcohol use. Low-alcohol beverages like ale, consumed with food and hydration, would have supported digestion, cardiovascular function, and caloric sufficiency. Coupled with the high nutrient content of dairy, grains, and herbs, moderate alcohol consumption likely enhanced overall well-being rather than undermining it. Even mead, consumed sparingly, provided energy, relaxation, and social bonding without the health risks associated with chronic overconsumption. Psychologically, the role of drink in social cohesion, ritual, and morale cannot be overstated. The long, dark winters and physically demanding lifestyle placed enormous stress on Viking communities. Ale and mead offered not only calories but also comfort, warmth, and a sense of ritualized order. The communal sharing of beverages reinforced social bonds, alleviated isolation, and provided small but meaningful pleasures that sustained mental health. In this way, Viking drinking practices were as much about emotional endurance as physical sustenance. In conclusion, the myths of uncontrolled Viking drinking obscure the deeper reality of a culture that integrated beverages into life with intelligence and discipline. Ale sustained, mead elevated, and dairy complemented. Herbs, berries, and imported spices enhanced both nutrition and flavor. Drinking was carefully timed, moderated, and embedded in social and environmental cycles. This combination fostered physical resilience, mental well-being, and social cohesion, illustrating that Viking drinking was neither reckless indulgence nor simple pleasure. It was a vital, strategic component of survival, health, and community. Through this lens, the Viking approach to beverages emerges as remarkably sophisticated. It balanced caloric needs, hydration, warmth, medicinal benefit, and social ritual. It addressed both individual and collective health while enhancing taste and psychological satisfaction. Far from the caricature of drunken barbarians, the Vikings exemplified a nuanced understanding of how drinking could serve life, not merely entertainment, demonstrating a wisdom born of necessity, observation, and tradition. In Viking society, drinking existed on a spectrum between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between daily sustenance and ritualized symbolism. Ale, mead, and other beverages were not simply liquids consumed for pleasure. They were carefully woven into the rhythms of survival, social hierarchy, and spiritual life. Understanding the distinction between daily and ceremonial drinking offers profound insight into the Viking worldview, revealing how necessity, culture, and belief intertwined in every cup. The contrast between these forms of drinking highlights both the pragmatism and the sophistication of a people whose lives were dictated by the harsh realities of the North. Daily drinking was fundamentally utilitarian. Ale, the cornerstone of ordinary consumption, was valued not for intoxication but for its nutritional and sustaining qualities. Low in alcohol, rich in calories, and often fortified with grain, ale provided energy for labor, warmth against the cold, and hydration when clean water was scarce. Daily drinking followed a disciplined rhythm, small cups in the morning, moderate portions at midday, and measured consumption in the evening. This structure ensured that households maintained physical strength, mental alertness, and endurance throughout the long, dark winters. Drinking in this sense was a tool of survival, closely integrated with food, fire, clothing, and labor. Dairy, another staple of daily life, complemented ale in its functional role. Milk, whey, and fermented dairy offered protein, fat, vitamins, and minerals, bridging the gaps left by seasonal food scarcity. Children, elders, and laborers all benefited from these nutritious drinks, which were consumed alongside ale or independently as needed. Herbs and local flavorings were occasionally added, not merely for taste, but to enhance digestibility and preserve the liquid for longer periods. Daily drinking was therefore a carefully managed system, designed to sustain life in a landscape that was as demanding as it was unforgiving. In contrast, ritual drinking carried symbolic, social, and spiritual significance that went far beyond mere sustenance. Mead, with its sweetness, higher alcohol content, and relative rarity, occupied a ceremonial space within Viking life. It was poured during blots, seasonal festivals, victories, marriages, and other events of communal or spiritual importance. The act of drinking mead was highly structured. It often involved designated elders, chieftains, or honored guests, and the passing of cups or horns was laden with meaning. To participate in ritual drinking was to affirm social bonds, honor the gods and ancestors, and recognize one's place within a structured cultural hierarchy. The contrast between daily and ritual drinking extended to timing, quantity, and context. Daily cups of ale were frequent, measured, and functional, consumed to meet physiological needs. Ritual drinks were occasional, potent, and ceremonial, consumed to mark significance, create memory, and reinforce cohesion. Where daily drinking satisfied the body, ritual drinking nourished the spirit. Where one demanded moderation for survival, the other demanded reverence and attentiveness for cultural continuity. Both forms, however, were guided by discipline, reflecting a society that balanced human needs with environmental challenges and social expectations. Ritual drinking also employed sensory and psychological dimensions absent in daily consumption. Mead's sweetness, golden hue, and aromatic qualities created a sensory experience that elevated the act beyond mere hydration. Flavorings, local herbs, imported spices, berries, added layers of complexity that enhanced the ceremonial atmosphere. In the glow of the longhouse fire, the passing of mead was an immersive act, connecting participants to ancestral memory, myth, and the divine. In this way, ritual drinking became a form of storytelling, education, and social reinforcement, embedding cultural knowledge in the very act of consumption. The symbolic role of ritual drinks also reinforced hierarchy and social cohesion. Elders and leaders often received the first pour, reflecting their status and the respect accorded to wisdom and authority. Young adults or initiates might be included in controlled measures, signaling integration into the household or community. Even in moments of celebration, drinking practices were deliberate. Waste was forbidden, and attention to propriety was paramount. Ritual drinking, therefore, served multiple purposes. It honored tradition, asserted social order, and reinforced collective responsibility. At the same time, daily drinking could influence ritual readiness. Ale maintained physical strength, supported warmth, and ensured that participants could endure long ceremonies. Nutritional stability enabled engagement in festivals, long storytelling sessions, or ritualized labor without compromising health. In this sense, daily drinking and ritual drinking were interdependent. One sustained life, the other elevated experience, and both together maintained the rhythm and resilience of Viking society. The interplay between symbolism and survival is perhaps most evident in the use of mead and ale together. During festivals, ale might still be consumed in moderation for energy, while mead was reserved for ceremonial toasts and oaths. The combination ensured that the body and spirit were both nourished, reinforcing the holistic philosophy underlying Viking drinking culture. Even scarcity did not diminish the importance of ritual. Households carefully allocated resources to ensure that both functional sustenance and ceremonial expression were preserved. Herbs, berries, and imported spices further enhanced this contrast. While daily drinks were flavored modestly to preserve palatability and nutrition, ritual beverages incorporated rare or exotic ingredients to create distinction, prestige, and memorability. A ceremonial mead infused with saffron or juniper berries signaled wealth, skill, and access to distant trade networks. Flavor thus became a symbolic tool, differentiating the ordinary from the extraordinary and reinforcing the cultural narrative embedded in every cup. Ultimately, the distinction between daily and ritual drinking reflects a broader Viking philosophy. Survival and culture were inseparable. The ordinary satisfied necessity, provided structure, and enabled endurance. The extraordinary carried meaning, reinforced identity, and nurtured the collective spirit. Both were governed by observation, experience, and social norms, demonstrating a society that was remarkably sophisticated in balancing human needs, environmental challenges, and cultural aspirations. In conclusion, the contrast between ritual and daily drinking illuminates the full depth of Viking drinking culture. Ale sustained life, dairy nourished bodies, and herbs and berries maintained health and variety. Mead elevated moments, connecting the living to the divine, the community, and tradition. This duality, function versus symbolism, necessity versus celebration, reveals a people who understood that every drink could serve multiple purposes, that survival and meaning were intertwined, and that the rhythm of drinking could shape both body and culture. Through this lens, Viking drinking emerges not as a chaotic indulgence but as a deliberate, integrated practice, balancing the practical demands of survival with the enduring need for social and spiritual connection. As the Nordic winter tightened its grip, covering fjords, forests, and settlements in snow and ice, the Vikings entered a season defined as much by ritual and myth as by practical survival. Long before modern calendars, their year was measured by cycles of light and darkness, by the ebb and flow of harvest, and by the rhythm of feasting and fasting. In this landscape, drinking was both sustenance and symbol, embedded in a broader system of winter rituals that reinforced cultural memory, maintained social cohesion, and ensured endurance through the darkest months. The winter season demanded preparation and discipline. Households stocked grain for ale, honey for mead, and milk for dairy drinks, while preserving meat, fish, and other perishables. These practical measures were supplemented by ceremonial planning. Feasts and rituals were scheduled to align with the cycles of the moon, solstices, and significant cultural events. Ale and mead were central to these observances. Ale sustained daily labor and warmth, while mead elevated moments of social and spiritual significance. Together, these drinks were carefully integrated into the seasonal rhythm, blending practicality with the sacred. Winter rituals, often centered on blots or ceremonial offerings, were occasions where drink assumed symbolic power. In these ceremonies, ale or mead was poured as a libation to gods, ancestors, or spirits, a gesture of respect, petition, or thanksgiving. The act of offering a drink was simultaneously spiritual and communal. It reaffirmed collective bonds, honored shared traditions, and invoked protection and prosperity for the household. The sensory experience, aroma, taste, and warmth, transformed liquid into a medium connecting humans with the divine and the natural world. In this context, drinking was elevated from necessity to a conduit of meaning. Feasting cycles followed a deliberate pattern. In early winter, shortly after the final harvest, households celebrated abundance and reinforced readiness for scarcity. Ale was plentiful, mead was shared sparingly, and feasts combined ritual with social negotiation. Communities came together, traveling across frozen rivers and snow-laden paths to participate. The passing of cups and horns was both practical and symbolic. It distributed resources while affirming alliances, social hierarchies, and mutual responsibility. These gatherings were immersive, multi-sensory events where the warmth of fire and drink countered the external cold, and where stories, songs, and myths reinforced cultural continuity. As winter deepened, rituals and feasts served additional survival purposes. The darkest months threatened morale, and the long nights could erode mental resilience. Communal drinking, accompanied by storytelling and ritual observance, provided emotional support. Ale offered steady calories and hydration, while mead punctuated moments with symbolic importance, reinforcing the sense of order and cultural identity. These practices mitigated isolation, creating psychological warmth alongside the physical comfort provided by food, drink, and fire. Drinking became a tool of both survival and social stability. The interplay of myth and drink was central to Viking winter practices. Tales of gods, heroes, and ancestral spirits were not merely entertainment, they encoded ethical, cultural, and practical wisdom. Ritual drinks acted as vessels for this knowledge. Each sip of mead or ale during storytelling reinforced connection to tradition and imparted lessons of bravery, loyalty, and resourcefulness. Seasonal myths emphasized the cycles of death and renewal, darkness and light, mirroring the natural rhythm of winter. Through drinking rituals, Vikings internalized these narratives, linking survival strategies to cultural identity. Spices, herbs, and other flavoring agents enhanced the significance of winter beverages. Juniper, birch bark, meadowsweet, and imported spices were added not only for taste but for symbolic or medicinal value. A spiced mead during a midwinter feast carried connotations of prosperity, protection, and sophistication. Even modest additions like berries or herbs reinforced the seasonal connection, reminding participants of summer abundance and the continuity of life despite the external harshness. Flavor, therefore, was entwined with ritual meaning, creating a multi-layered experience that engaged body, mind, and spirit. The cyclical nature of feasting and drinking reflected a balance between indulgence and moderation. Resources were scarce during winter, so households carefully allocated ale and mead to support daily labor, social gatherings, and ceremonial occasions. Excess was discouraged, and preservation was paramount. Rituals ensured that the consumption of rare beverages like mead was meaningful and strategic, while everyday ale provided consistent sustenance. In this way, Vikings harmonized survival with celebration, ensuring that both practical needs and cultural imperatives were met. Winter rituals also reinforced intergenerational knowledge. Elders taught brewing techniques, storage methods, and the proper use of herbs and spices. They guided younger members through ceremonial observances, explaining the symbolism of each gesture, cup, and offering. Through participation, children and young adults learned the dual role of drink in survival and culture. The act of drinking thus became educational, embedding practical skills, ethical frameworks, and spiritual understanding within a single, holistic practice. Even small, daily rituals, sipping ale at the hearth, offering a cup to neighbors, or sharing fermented dairy, were infused with meaning. These acts connected households to the larger community, creating a network of interdependence that enhanced survival. They also provided continuity, bridging the gap between ordinary sustenance and ceremonial significance. In the extreme environment of winter, every drink, every cup, carried layers of purpose, nourishment, comfort, social cohesion, and cultural memory. Ultimately, Viking winter rituals and feasting cycles reveal a society in which drink was central to both survival and meaning. Ale, mead, and dairy were not merely beverages, they were instruments of endurance, carriers of myth, and markers of social and spiritual order. Rituals transformed ordinary liquids into symbols of connection, continuity, and hope, providing both psychological and physical sustenance. Through these practices, the Vikings demonstrated remarkable adaptability, integrating necessity with culture, survival with storytelling, and nutrition with ritual. In conclusion, the winter season, with its darkness, cold, and scarcity, was transformed by the deliberate use of drink, ritual, and feasting. The Vikings' understanding of the interplay between sustenance and symbolism allowed them to endure extreme conditions while reinforcing social bonds and cultural identity. Every cup of ale or mead carried multiple layers of meaning, linking the physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of life. Winter drinking was not mere indulgence. It was a sophisticated, integrated practice, ensuring survival, reinforcing myth, and celebrating the enduring rhythms of the natural and human world. The echoes of Viking drinking resonate far beyond the fjords and longhouses of medieval Scandinavia, carrying lessons in survival, culture, and ingenuity that continue to captivate modern imagination. Today, we picture Vikings raising ornate drinking horns, toasting gods and ancestors with mead, or gathering in great halls to drink ale by the firelight. Yet, beneath these iconic images lies a nuanced reality. Viking beverages were carefully balanced instruments of sustenance, social cohesion, and ritual significance. Modern interpretations often romanticize or exaggerate these practices, but a closer examination of historical evidence, archaeology, and comparative ethnography reveals a culture whose relationship with drink was both sophisticated and deeply practical. Contemporary fascination with Viking drinking often centers on spectacle, the dramatic raising of horns, the perception of constant revelry, and the mythic power of mead. Popular media, reenactments, and tourism frequently emphasize ceremonial or ritualized consumption, focusing on communal feasts or religious offerings. While visually compelling, these portrayals can overshadow the more fundamental aspects of daily life. Ale, fermented dairy, and other modest beverages formed the backbone of Viking nutrition, providing calories, protein, hydration, and even medicinal support. Without these practical drinks, ceremonial or symbolic consumption would have been impossible. Modern audiences often overlook this balance, yet it is essential for understanding Viking resilience. Archaeological findings provide further insight into the complexity of Viking drinking practices. Residue analysis of drinking vessels, fermentation remnants, and storage containers demonstrates that ale and mead were consumed in both functional and ceremonial contexts. Chemical traces reveal the use of local herbs, berries, and even imported spices, confirming the sophistication of flavoring, preservation, and nutritional strategies. Skeletal analysis shows that despite harsh climates, Vikings maintained reasonably good nutrition and physical robustness. These findings challenge myths of unrestrained indulgence, highlighting instead a culture that integrated beverages carefully into daily life, survival strategies, and ceremonial occasions. Modern brewing enthusiasts and historians often attempt to reconstruct Viking drinks based on archaeological and textual evidence. Recipes for ale, mead, and fermented dairy frequently include juniper berries, birch bark, honey, and local herbs, mirroring historical practices. Some experimental brewers even attempt to incorporate spices imported through trade networks, such as saffron or pepper, to explore the sensory sophistication of Viking beverages. These recreations provide tangible insight into Viking flavor preferences, fermentation techniques, and the interplay between practical sustenance and symbolic significance. They also illuminate the ways in which drink was a medium for innovation, experimentation, and adaptation in extreme climates. Cultural memory of Viking drinking also influences modern celebrations, festivals, and reenactments. Annual gatherings, medieval fairs, and heritage tourism often feature feasts with ale, mead, and horned cups, evoking the social and ritual dimensions of Viking life. Participants gain an embodied understanding of communal drinking, storytelling, and ceremonial practices. While these events blend entertainment with historical interpretation, they underscore the enduring fascination with Viking practices and the ways in which beverages remain central to cultural identity, both then and now. The symbolic and psychological roles of Viking drinks continue to resonate in contemporary narratives. Modern interpretations emphasize how ale, mead, and dairy were not merely sustenance but instruments of comfort, warmth, and social connection. The passing of cups in communal settings, the sensory pleasure of flavor, aroma, and texture, and the deliberate pacing of consumption all highlight a sophisticated understanding of human needs. These insights challenge stereotypes of Vikings as solely violent or indulgent, instead portraying them as adaptive, intelligent, and socially cohesive, a society attuned to both physical survival and cultural continuity. Trade and the integration of imported spices offer additional lessons for modern observers. The Vikings' use of exotic ingredients demonstrates early globalization, experimentation, and appreciation for sensory diversity. Even in a world defined by scarcity and harsh environmental conditions, they sought to enrich daily life with flavor, status, and variety. Contemporary brewers and historians find inspiration in this ingenuity, exploring combinations of local and imported ingredients to recreate beverages that are at once practical, symbolic, and pleasurable. The balance of scarcity, creativity, and sensory enrichment provides a model for understanding the interplay between necessity and culture in any society. Viking drinking also illuminates the integration of health, nutrition, and ritual. Modern interpretations can learn from the careful calibration of alcohol content, the use of dairy and fermented beverages, and the incorporation of herbs and spices. Ale provided steady calories and hydration, mead offered symbolic and social energy, and dairy supplied protein, vitamins, and minerals. Herbs and imported spices enhanced flavor and nutrition, sometimes even providing mild medicinal benefits. This holistic system underscores how drinking can serve multiple purposes simultaneously, blending sustenance, ritual, and social cohesion in a sustainable, culturally embedded manner. The cultural memory of Viking drinking continues to influence storytelling, literature, and popular imagination. From epic sagas to novels and television series, beverages symbolize power, endurance, and connection to heritage. Horns and cups become vessels not only for liquid but for narrative, embodying tales of bravery, survival, and divine favor. Modern audiences, while captivated by spectacle, also absorb lessons about the deliberate, disciplined, and socially integrative nature of Viking drinking. The imagery reinforces a sense of continuity, linking contemporary fascination with the practical realities of survival, communal life, and cultural expression. Even in academic discourse, Viking drinking serves as a lens for exploring broader cultural themes: adaptation to environment, integration of nutrition and ritual, trade and exchange, and social cohesion. Ale and mead are no longer seen merely as intoxicants but as instruments that reveal how communities managed risk, scarcity, and physical and psychological endurance. By studying these practices, scholars gain insight into the complex interplay of survival, culture, and belief, understanding that every cup carried intention, function, and meaning. Ultimately, the legacy of Viking drinking lies in its integration of survival, symbolism, and social intelligence. Modern interpretations, whether in brewing, reenactment, or scholarship, highlight both the mythic grandeur and the practical sophistication of these practices. Ale, mead, and dairy were more than beverages. They were tools of endurance, markers of status, carriers of cultural memory, and instruments of communal cohesion. Herbs, spices, and flavoring agents enriched their sensory and medicinal value, while trade expanded horizons, connecting remote households to distant worlds. In conclusion, Viking drinking is remembered today not only as a cultural curiosity but as a testament to human ingenuity, adaptation, and the ability to merge necessity with meaning. Each sip, whether of ale, mead, or fermented dairy, carried layers of survival, symbolism, and social connection. Modern fascination with Viking drinking, through historical reconstruction, popular media, or scholarly analysis, reveals enduring respect for this balance of function, ritual, and culture. The Vikings, through their careful and deliberate use of beverages, created a legacy that continues to inspire, educate, and captivate, reminding us that even in the harshest climates, human creativity and social intelligence can transform survival into a practice of meaning and connection.